Hello everyone, you're very welcome to this very special online reunion for the classes of 1960 and 1970, celebrating your diamond and golden jubilees. In normal times, we'd mark these wonderful milestones together in O'Reilly Hall, sharing fond memories, stories and laughter with old friends and classmates. Memories of sitting exams in the great hall at Earlsfort Terrace, or the excitement of moving to the new Belfield campus, the romance of college dress dances, and the legendary antics of Paddy the porter. But as we know, 2020 has not been a normal year. We've seen many of our hopes and plans upended and our social lives curtailed. Yet the strength of the human spirit prevails, and we're finding new ways to interact and to support each other. I know that this is not the reunion you expected or hoped for, but I applaud your goodwill in adapting to the current circumstances and thank you most sincerely for your understanding. Protecting your health and well-being is our utmost priority at this time. I'm immensely proud of the UCD community and our collective response to the challenges of the last 6 months. Our students, faculty and researchers have been exemplary in their courage and determination and have been at the forefront of Ireland's response to the pandemic, from fundraising and volunteering to designing and manufacturing critical medical equipment and developing clinical treatments for COVID-19. And you, our valued alumni, are a vital source of strength and support across these endeavours. From volunteering your time and skills to generously supporting the UCD COVID-19 Emergency Fund, you have been behind us all the way. Knowing that we can rely on your steadfast commitment and generosity gives us the strength to persevere through these challenging times. It also gives me great hope for a brighter future. I hope you have enjoyed this event today, albeit virtually, and I look forward to welcoming you back on campus when public health guidelines allow us to get together.
Good evening and welcome to this unique celebration of the graduation of the class of 1970 in UCD and also of the class of 1960. Now, as you will know, we had hoped to gather in the O'Reilly Hall to have a big celebration, but obviously because of COVID restrictions, we have decided instead to record the content of what would have taken place on stage and to come to you from this wonderful university club on the UCD campus. We've brought together some of the graduates from both of those years, some of whom are here with me and some of whom haven't been able to attend in person but will be talking to you by video link. By the way, all the 1970 graduates are women and all the 1960 graduates are men. Now, that wasn't intentional, it's kind of the way it happened. But it's interesting to see that how it reflects the change that happened over those years. Back in 1960, 29% of the graduates were women. By 1970, that had gone up to 32%, which isn't huge. But if you look at 2019, it's 52%. So the change had begun to happen through the 60s, and it probably rocketed then through the 70s and 80s. Our guests, as I say, are here with me are from the 1970 graduation group. And so I'll start by introducing them to you. Bride Rosney graduated with a BSc in 1970, and she went on to have a career firstly in education as a teacher, educational researcher and school principal. But then she moved on to a number of other careers, among them that of Special Advisor to Mary Robinson in her time as President of Ireland and as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Director of Communications with RTE, and a founding director of the Mary Robinson Foundation Climate Justice. Úna Claffey has a BA in History, Ethics, Politics and Metaphysics. Having spent some time in the United States, she came back to Ireland and in 1977 joined RTE as a production assistant. She went on to work as a political correspondent in Leinster House and in 2000 was appointed political advisor to then Taoiseach Bertie Ahern. Mary Finlay Geoghegan is a renowned lawyer and judge. She was appointed to the High Court in 2002, the Court of Appeal in 2014, and the Supreme Court in 2017, before she retired last year. But Mary's first degree wasn't in law at all. She had an arts degree in pure maths and maths physics. As for myself, I too was an arts student, graduated with a BA in French and Spanish. I counted, as I was preparing this, that I have had 6 careers, which is quite a rambling route through life. But I started as a sociolinguistic researcher. I worked then as a TV presenter and a radio producer and presenter. I then became an arts manager. I then worked as an arts consultant with an expertise in festivals. I then went back to being an independent radio producer. And have I forgotten anything? Anyway, I finally ended up in voice and presentation training with occasional forays into voiceover work. So I think of all of us, I have the most circuitous route through life. But let's start with thinking back to the time we all arrived here in UCD. Bride, did you know exactly what it was you wanted to do when you came here? What was the route you took to making the decision?
To be honest, the route that brought me to UCD was nothing to do with UCD. All I ever wanted to do was be a teacher. I really never wanted to leave school. I had loved every minute, both at junior level and at post-secondary level in teaching was where I wanted to be. And my big problem coming to UCD, I lived in Dublin. It was the obvious place to go to if I wasn't going to go to Trinity, which I wasn't because I was from a very Catholic middle-class background in Dublin, and it was going to be UCD. What did I want to do? My teaching, I didn't care. I really didn't care. My 2 best subjects in school had been science and history, so it was going to be one of them. And I didn't make my mind up until I went in to register, and I had a check. It was going to be 90 guineas, I think, or 64 guineas for arts. And I didn't know until I went into the hall which one I was going to do. And I joined the science queue because there were 4 or 5 people in it that I knew.
Yeah.
It was also a shorter queue, and I was out of there quicker. So that's what brought me to UCD.
What a great way to start.
Yeah.
Una, what about you?
Well, I had finished school at 16. I had done my Leaving Cert at 16, and the good Loretto nuns suggested I go away for a year because I was too young to come into UCD. So I spent a wonderful year on the French Riviera in Nice, studying in the university there and working in a school. And at the end of it, I really wanted to go to Paris and go to the Sorbonne. But my father said, at 17, you are not going to Paris, you are coming home. So I came home to UCD, but I come from a working class background. So apart from cousins in Britain, whom I didn't know, who, one of them was in Trinity and one qualified as a barrister in London, I was the first member of my family to go to 3rd level. And I just wanted to do it. And I had thought of teaching, but had sort of put that out of my mind. And I just... The idea of an academic experience really attracted me, and because I had enjoyed it in Nice, I came here. But I was miserable in my first year. I really didn't want to be here. I wanted to be in Paris. And I did no work, and I felt very alienated being a first year. And so much so that in one of the first weeks when I wanted to go to the loo, I was afraid to ask anybody in Earlsfort Terrace where it was. So I went across the green to the country shop, which was a little restaurant on the other side of the green, to use their loo. Most of my first year was in the main hall. Mm-hmm. And I failed my first year exams. And then the following year, I joined the university's branch of the Labour Party, which drew its membership from Trinity and UCD. And politics really became, my raison d'etre for the rest of my university career, such as it was. But I did finally get a degree.
Good for you. Well, we'll come back to that politics in a moment. But Mary, you started doing maths and maths physics. So, I know there was law in your family, but had there been talk about maybe doing law?
No, I don't recall any talk about doing law. I'd always liked doing maths at school. I enjoyed doing maths. I was at a very good school, the Sacred Heart in Monkstown, and we had a brilliant maths teacher, but she refused to teach honours maths to our class because she said she couldn't teach one or two people honours maths and teach pass maths the rest. I think in many girls' schools honours maths wasn't taught. So my parents had arranged, one of the teachers from Blackrock College came into our house every week, twice a week I think, for the last 2 years at school, and I did honours maths for my leaving from that. And like Una, I was a little bit young doing my leaving cert, and I'd done a deal with my parents to avoid going to boarding school earlier and agreed to go away. But this time I went to Scotland and to another Sacred Heart school where I did the Oxford and Cambridge A-level maths for a year, and I came back then, and really the only thing I was ever going to do in college was maths, and I had no clue what I was going to do after that, and I don't recall getting really any advice as to what else I would do with the pure maths, and so I became aware that there was either an arts degree or a science degree, that you could do the same honours degree in pure maths and maths physics through either arts or science, and we were the same. And I chose to do it through arts, which meant that I did French and Latin in my first year as subsidiary pass subjects, and I just kind of followed my way into that and stayed there. And I think what I did in UCD will come out later, really, but I enjoyed the maths. It was good.
Great. Earlsfort Terrace, in which three of us did our training, I was going to say, it was hardly a training, got our education, our university education, was a particular environment which was on its last legs, really, because I think by 1970 things had started to come out to Belfield. I'll come to Bride in a moment about what Belfield was like. But you mentioned was it called the main hall where we went in?
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, the energy and the buzz and the excitement. I can still remember my first day so vividly, because I went in like Bride did with my cheque to register from my father, but I went straight into the Great Hall where the societies, like a Freshers' Week thing was set up, and I marched straight down to join the ones I wanted to join, and I did it, and then I was happy. But the atmosphere there was unique, really, wasn't it, around that Great Hall, Una?
Well, it was, because, of course, Earlsfort Terrace was grossly overcrowded. And one of the big complaints that students had at the time was the inadequacy of the library facilities. So that was where people had to go. They didn't have anywhere else to go. It wasn't a huge big campus like this magnificent affair here. And for those of us who were women, of course, there was the ladies' reading room, which was a very small little room. You probably remember.
I remember it well. Full of coats.
With the coal
we
fire
and
the
there.
coats and the smell of the damp coats on a wet day. But that was a source of great gossip. So we had that. We had one wonderful person in UCD who sat just inside the door, Paddy, the head porter. And throughout the turbulent years that were to follow in the 60s, Paddy, was a wonderful, kind and guiding hand. But it was just, I just remember it always being crammed, except when people like me were supposed to be at my lectures, and when I was sitting there, instead of being at my lectures, conspiring, it was kind of empty. And then, of course, there was the annex downstairs where we had the greasy spoon teas and lunches.
Oh, do you remember that, Mary?
Oh, I remember so well. But I agree with you. I like the main hall. I've no recollection of my first days in UCD. I do remember vaguely going in to register like everybody else with a cheque from your parents to pay the fees, which I think were around 60 pounds,
60 guineas, I think, 60, at the time.
Oh, perhaps, yeah. And the main hall, there was a place where you met people. And then the Great Hall was what is now the concert hall beyond the main hall, which was a library, used as a library in part, and
an exam hall too.
And an exam hall, yes,
time.
And a graduation.
Yes.
That's where where my degree was conferred in November.
Do you remember the
70?
library and Miss Power, was that her name?
Yeah, that's the Law and History Library, I think, upstairs.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Where Miss Power and Miss Semple.
Yes,
Miss Semple.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it was a bit like school, like having the nun in
Miss
charge.
Power with her grey hair drawn back very severely
That's
into
right.
a bun at the nape of her neck. Very nice woman, but very polite, very decorous. But I used to take books out of the library and leave them, which was very antisocial. Leave them sitting on the desk and go off doing other things.
Oh, we all did that.
I think
You
weren't
close
al-
your space.
You
Yeah.
weren't alone in that.
But given that there was so much pressure on the facilities,
On the
it was a
space.
pretty selfish thing to do. But
it was very
yeah.
hard to get a
Very.
library spot
It was.
at certain times of the year.
And I don't know about the rest of you, but there was a lot of dreaming went on while sitting in the library and observing young men coming in and sitting
Indeed.
down at a distance and little
And
harmless little fantasies.
And observing who else was speaking to who else. There was a way of observing romantic liaisons which were commencing as people walked around the library, I think.
Indeed. And of course we were not supposed to be wearing trousers. Was it
No,
67
there was a
that
ban.
changed?
There was a ban on.
It had been lifted. My understanding
No,
was...
I was actually part of the lifting of it. I can claim that.
Were you?
Actually, I was going to a colours match on a Saturday afternoon, which was a rugby match between, I think it was UCD and Trinity. And I wore trousers in too. And that, I wasn't the only person, but that was when we actually broke the ban. And really, it passed without comment.
Yeah.
Its time had
was
come.
such
It was
ridiculous.
absurd.
Yeah.
And the college would have been very stupid to start, trying to hammer people for wearing trousers.
Yeah.
So, but the ban was there until then. I can't
But
remember what year that was.
Well, I think I can tell you, because I think you said you went to UCD in 66.
No, in 65.
Oh, in 65. Well, it had gone. My recollection is that some of my class from school who had gone in 66, it was still in force when they went in 66, and it was
So it must have been
went
66,
during
67.
the 66. It had gone before we started. Doireann, would you remember that?
No, I don't remember the detail of it, but Bride, you would remember,
I
because Bride
remember
was
it.
in Belfield. This was another
Remember it
republic
very,
out here.
very clearly, because the ban was the trousers ban was a big issue in Belfield. I remember my first day coming into Belfield, and you've mentioned already, Paddy, the porter in Earlsfort Terrace. Equally, the porters in Belfield were terribly important. And my first day, I went to a porter and I said, I'm meant to be in room, where do I go? Because I knew nothing. And he said, well, you have to go downstairs, and it's at the very end of the corridor or whatever. He gave me directions. So I headed to the stairway, and he called me back and he said, don't use that stairs. Use that one over there, which was right down at the far corner. And I said, oh, why? And he said, because when you go down, have a look back. And it turned out that all the stairs, it was a very new building, it was an open plan stairway.
Yeah.
And you'd all the guys
At the
sitting
bottom.
at the bottom, underneath the stairs. And I couldn't believe this, to be honest. But worse, I was doing practical subjects, biology, botany and zoology, and we had a lot of field work. So we were going out, to see shores, our friends or whatever, and we were not allowed to wear trousers. If you turned up in trousers, you were not allowed to go. Now it went, I started in 66, it went in 67.
So
But it was
ridiculous.
absolutely
But did you
insane.
tell me as well, Bride, when we were speaking earlier, that there were assigned seating spaces? I mean, in Earlsfort Terrace, you just went in, you sat
you
down,
sat where you
wherever.
could get a
But
space.
here, the women and the men were separated.
The women and the men were separated. I can remember so clearly zoology, which was in the biggest lecture hall in the then new building. Front 2 rows were men and about 18 rows of men behind. And we used to have a lot of vets and pre-meds and ags coming in to join with the science. You had a number, so you were row A, number 3 or whatever.
Really?
And a roll call was checked every day. And if A3 was not covered, your number, a letter went home if you missed 3 lectures.
It's like
John
school.
Charles McQuaid was still around.
It was
and
like
it was
school,
still,
though. It was school.
Yeah, and it was also the Catholic University for a Catholic
that
nation.
never happened in
Not
the
in the
terrace, because I
terrace,
know
no.
in my maths class, I remember the guys who were doing science telling in first year they had been out here like you in Belfield doing physics and chemistry,
Yeah.
and they said there were exactly that, huge physics lectures by the then, I think, Dean, Professor Nevin, yeah.
Tommy
And if their seat wasn't covered, the name was taken. They all had to sit in the assigned seats. But evidently what happened was, I was told that after the roll call was taken, there'd be guys who'd get up and they'd just walk out.
Yeah.
Mass exodus.
And Professor Nevin would say, what number were you at? But he'd no clue. And they just walked out.
Nice way around it. Mary, the highlight, I suspect, for you, because I remember this from 1967, was the LNH. The Literary and Historical Society debating on a Saturday night. I mean, how could you tell anybody now that that was the highlight of the week, that on a Saturday night you'd go into Earlsfort Terrace and sit and listen to people talking? But it was fantastic.
Oh, it absolutely was, and it was a different era. And I suppose the late 60s were a very exciting era to be in college, because there was a lot happening politically around the world, external to Ireland and external to the college as well within it, which I'm sure you'll ask Una about later. But the LNH was just fantastic. As you say, it met in the old physics theatre, G32, in Earlsfort Terrace on a Saturday night. I think that was a lecture hall that held 1,000 people approximately, or certainly when the people were standing in as well, there were up to 1,000 people. If you had a popular debate, it was absolutely crammed, people standing the whole way around. It was regarded as one of the best debating chambers in the universities in these islands because of the shape. It was much broader and lower than some of the current lecture halls here. But I went along in my first year in the autumn of 67. I remember Henry Kelly, who was fantastic, was auditor.
What a performer.
What a performer, and his repartee. But the first night I went was a night, there was private debate followed by public debate, and there were always guests invited for public debate, and the motion had been announced. And the first night I went, the invited guest speaker, who were always advertised, was a Russian diplomat from the Russian embassy in London. And that was a time when obviously Reds under the beds, communists, no diplomatic relations with Russia here. The place was electric. The special branch were alleged to be creeping all over the auditorium, and it was a fantastic, and I was absolutely hooked from there on. And that was the central focus of my life in UCD, was the LNH. During first year at some stage, I mustered up the courage to you mentioned Paddy Keogh, the LNH list of speakers, if you wanted to speak in public debate on Saturday night, was in the porter's office, and you went in and you put your name up and you might be chosen to speak, and you were told if you were on the speakers list in advance. And in my second year, I was on, Dermot Gleeson was auditor, who was another fantastic performer. I was on his committee. And there were 2 slots for women on the auditors committee, always, correspondence secretary, social secretary. Surprise. I started as social secretary, and Dorry Finan was the correspondent, and she resigned during the year, and I moved up to be correspondence secretary, and Barbara Brennan took my place. And I continued to participate. We had some fantastic nights there, but the repartee, and I think it's very hard to explain to people how, Una, you mentioned earlier that it was really central part of college life, and people came from all sorts of faculties to attend, and you could go into the G32 on a Saturday night, and you were guaranteed entertainment during private business from 7:30 to 8:30. The guest speakers would start and public debate about 8:30. People normally stayed for the guest speakers perhaps at the beginning, and then the student speakers. People peeled out then, went to the pubs down at the corner at the end of Leeson Street, Kerwin's, O'Donoghue's, Hartigan's, depending on where you were going. People might come back in the end, because if you were in the inner circle, there was a party to be had every Saturday night in somebody's house at the end of the debate. And our poor parents, I mean, my parents had LNH parties starting at 11:30 or midnight in our house in Blackrock throughout my 4 years that I was involved. So anyway,
Amazing.
it was fantastic, and the Sunday papers came and covered
Yes.
it.
They did. I
It was
still
very
found
important.
an
It
old
was very
scrapbook at home
important.
with reports and photographs
It was
from the
very
LNH.
important.
Una, you would have attended those debates as
Oh,
well.
yes, and I mean, Mary is quite right. I mean, the LNH was very influential. It was influential in Irish society too.
But it expanded
just,
our
it wasn't
knowledge.
just dismissed, you know, as students, because there were really talented people there. And as Mary said, you know, the outside speakers. I mean, in those days, you had to get permission from the college to invite a speaker to a student society, and the poster had to be passed before you were allowed to put it up. I mean, I remember this from my days in the universities branch. And
The university's branch of the Labour Party.
Yeah. And it was central. And you see, it was free. Like students then, we didn't have money. So, I mean, rather than go to somebody's nice home in Blackrock for parties, the parties I remember were some grotty basement flat with a 6-pack of beer for the night.
Yeah.
But the LNH was quite remarkable. And I canvassed for Henry Kelly. And
did you?
I did, yeah.
Did you
and
canvass
a
for
few
me?
others.
I don't think so.
Well, I think I was involved in other things by law, but I certainly would have supported Jermaine.
I remember Henry
the first
Kelly.
woman auditor, of course.
Henry Kelly and Dermot Gleeson were
Yeah.
the two people I remember most. I mean,
Yeah,
they were
were
performers.
Oh, they were
Absolutely.
fantastic, and there were other wonderful
And there was
performers.
Esmond Smythe.
Esmond Smith,
Oh,
he
yes.
was a
Another-
fantastic performer. But there were
Yeah.
other people, and there were people who entertained. Peter, Leo, Mary Gibson,
Oh, indeed,
who
yeah.
entertained.
Of course,
And Paul Kenny, the brother of Pat Kenny.
Yes.
Pat was much more serious. He came up and debated from Marion Street. He was an engineer.
Yeah.
A few
Yeah.
engineers
Yeah.
came up from Marion Street
Yeah.
and debated. And there were, and of course, the star coming on a little bit by the time. Jerry Barry was the late
course.
Jerry Barry
Yeah.
was auditor, who you would have known
Yeah.
well, I'm sure.
I knew him very well, and
Yeah.
in fact,
Yeah.
when because I obviously worked for his election as well, I seem to spend an awful lot of my life working for elections. But there was the Tribune, I think, had started to be published, and there was a front page picture of me kissing Jerry and congratulating him. I mean, that was how important it was in Irish life.
And yet,
you know?
I presume, Bride, it was of no consequence to you.
It was of absolutely no consequence. I remember hearing from somebody who did attend college in Earlsfort Terrace that they referred to Belfield as the Polytech out in Belfield. And to be honest, there was an element of truth in it. There really was. All that was on Belfield at the time was the science block with 3 wings, physics, chemistry and biology, the church and the lake. There was literally nothing else.
It was
here.
very bleak, wasn't it?
It was very bleak. There was no bus. You got the bus to Clonskey Road or to RTE.
Really?
At the other end. They were the 2 bus stops.
There was no bar.
There was... What? Yeah, and we really didn't go into... our bar was the Montrose Hotel. We really didn't go into Harshkins. We didn't go to the LNH. And we didn't feel part of college in that respect.
So what entertainment did you have for yourselves?
We created our own.
Which was what?
My main involvement in entertainment in UCD was gambling.
Gambling.
There was a very, very active card school. And unlike you've referred to the ladies' reading room in Earlsfort Terrace, the ladies' reading room in Belfield was the headquarters of the gambling den for both sexes.
Fantastic.
Because the porters never went in. There was no such thing as a female porter. The porters didn't go in. They had total respect for the ladies' common room or reading room. The male lecturers didn't go in. Any female lecturer who happened to come in left pretty quickly. And there was one particular point. I mean, I wasn't alone. I was very involved, definitely. But several of us never had to work when we were in
Because
college.
of your winnings?
Because of our winnings.
Isn't that fantastic?
And
Wow.
which card games?
Poker was the big one, and there was a game called Blue Lady,
Oh,
which is all based around the Queen of Spades being the most high point card. But they were the 2 games, and occasionally if somebody ventured in who shouldn't be there, we'd talk bridge terms as if we were playing bridge. You know?
So you had a cover story as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if somebody asked for the cards, meaning your student cards, you'd hand them the deck of cards, you know. But it was crazy.
Yeah, it's
but
amazing
we did
that
feel
there were
very
these
different.
parallel universes.
Very
isn't it?
different.
Now, what we have to refer to, of course, Una, you were an activist from day one almost, weren't you?
Almost,
but,
yeah.
But then along
year
came
on.
the Gentle Revolution in the middle of all this.
Well,
and
the
I know
Gentle Revolution didn't just come along.
Well, of course.
We created it.
Yeah, over the coming years. And everybody, even though you were a serious activist, a lot of people got sucked into it, didn't they?
Well, that's the point I was going to make. You know, there was no enthusiasm amongst the student body in Earlsfort Terrace to move to Belfield because of its isolation from the centre of the city, because it was like a building site, because, as some people incorrectly and unfairly referred to it, as a polytechnic. But the facilities were very bad in UCD, so that a number of us, you know, this was the 60s. I mean, Mary has already alluded to events that were happening elsewhere. I mean, there was the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, there was the civil rights movement in the States, there was the anti-Vietnam world revulsion, there was the student movements in Europe. It was a time when change was sweeping the student world everywhere. And so a number of us who were infused with radical thought, people like Kevin Myers, people like Rory Quinn, people like Basil Miller, young John Feeney, Owen Sweeney, we formed the Students for Democratic Action. And it was just a broad coalition of people who just really wanted change. And we had very close associations with the left-wing students in Trinity. So, in fact, one of my earliest memories of that activism is that Basil Miller, Rory Quinn and I called for a demonstration. I won't go into the details why, it's too convoluted, but down to Trinity, and we printed and circulated leaflets. And I remember Gareth Fitzgerald coming over to me in the main hall and admonishing me, teaching me a very, very important lesson. You've called for people to come out and support this demonstration, and you haven't signed your names. And it was a very good lesson. If it's important enough to you, put your name to it. But really things are coming to a head in terms of Belfield. The library situation in Belfield was dire in terms of what students were going to go out to. So that an awful lot of the students who became swept up, if you like, in the Gentle Revolution, so-called, were genuinely worried about what their futures were going to be. Before the Gentle Revolution proper got on, there was an occupation of the School of Architecture by the architects. Now, they had nothing to do with the Gentle Revolution. There was some crossover in terms of the students.
But it was in the air.
But they were about to lose recognition. The graduates were about to lose recognition from the Royal Institute of British Architects, which was their trade union ticket, if you like, although they wouldn't have seen it in that language, but in terms of when they left college. So it was a very, very serious issue for them. And as you say, change was in the air. It was a very repressive Ireland. Lots of things were happening outside the universities in terms of change. And I have to say, I'm very glad that I was part of it.
Oh, yeah. It was an absolutely marvellous time.
Yeah.
I was apolitical isn't strong enough a word. I mean, I had no interest when I came. Theatre was my thing. I had joined Dramsoc, the Colman Pearce. There was even a play in French. That's all I wanted to do. But I couldn't. The Gentle Revolution really blew my mind in the sense that I began to get curious about the outer world. And I think it had that effect on a lot of people.
It had.
And hanging around, listening to the speakers, and again, a bit like the LNH, but these guys and girls who could stand up and just
the eloquence of Kevin Myers. I mean,
he was remarkable.
Yeah.
So it was a really important time. But I think we won't spend too much time on it here today because most of those of you who are watching us probably will remember all the marking of that event last year.
Yes,
but
quite.
suffice to say that it was formative, really.
Yes,
for
but
everybody.
it had an impact. For instance, in the LNH. I remember that week so well. In the spring of 69, and I think John Gleeson, as auditor of the LNH, chaired one of those big meetings in the main hall. But it impacted on the LNH, and perhaps it was a mark of, I know the SDA were not very happy with the LNH, about people involved in the LNH, I seem to remember a term, lily-livered liberals, as being a term of abuse for those people involved.
Nice term of alliteration, though.
The LNH. Yes, I'm sure it was somebody perhaps like Kevin Mars.
Like
I don't
Kevin
know
Mars,
who,
exactly.
or Rory Quinn or somebody, but the following Saturday night in the LNH, for the only time in my experience over the 4 years I was in it in college, where private business started with members of the SDA coming in with emotion about the attitude of the college authorities and changes as it had, as it were, developed out of the Belfield issue into much broader issues as the week went on, or 10 days. And we abandoned public debate, which was meant to be an impromptu, amusing debate, and there was a very serious debate all night within the LNH. And as you say, I think a lot of students who were not involved perhaps in the LNH or in any way politicised became involved in the issues that were arising as to the future shape and governance of the college from
and then
those days.
I mean, there were lots of things happening in the wider society as well, and all of that began to filter in. I mean, it was a
Dublin
really
Housing
important-
Action.
Well, absolutely.
Dublin Housing Action.
Yeah,
and
I was very involved in the Dublin Housing Action Association.
That
I
was
was
another
involved in
big-
anything that made trouble, but it never ceases to annoy me now that we're back with very bad housing conditions in this country, like we were in the 60s. And in the 60s was when tenements collapsed in Fenian Street and people died.
That's right.
And, you know,
And here
the
we are.
situation is as bad now as it, almost as bad now as it was then.
Listen, I'm realising, because time is marching on very quickly, that we've had no discussion at all about our academic lives in this time. Did you get a good education, did you feel, Bride?
I got a good education. I did not get a good degree. I took the scenic route. I took 4 years to do a 3-year pass degree, and I say I just about scraped to pass. But I genuinely feel I got a very, very good education, both here and at second level. And by that, I was not fettered by concerns about career. I always knew, as I said, that I wanted to teach, and I knew what I needed was just a pass degree. I got it.
Comfortable place to be.
It was a very comfortable place and a very privileged place, and I could stay here to do my HDIP, the Higher Diploma in Education. And even though it was a requirement then that you had to teach, I never taught when I was doing the HDIP because I was able to work as a demonstrator in zoology practicals here, teaching people pre-meds how to dissect earthworms. But that counted. They didn't supervise it or anything, but they accepted that as a teaching practice.
Because
wrong,
I would have done
wrong, quite honestly.
I would have done the HDIP at the same time as
But
you
you
did.
probably taught.
I did, yeah. And I hated coming out here. It was just like a factory to me, and I got stuck in a lift over there one day, and nobody came to rescue me because there was nobody in the building. It was just,
Yeah,
it was just
it
weird.
was the Polytechnic in Belfield.
Do you feel, both of you, Una and Mary, that you had academically got a good education?
Well, like Bride, I took the scenic route and I ended up with a pass degree, but at least I ended up with a degree. And I remember saying to the wonderful, wonderful Sister Benvenuta, who is such a support to students, you know. She was a marvellous woman as well as a very fine academic. But I remember saying to her, you know, I've just got a pass degree and I really haven't done well. And both Basil Miller and Kevin Myers, in spite of all their activism, both managed to get first-class honours degrees. And I said to her, you know, I said, well, kind of haven't done well. And she said, Una, she said, you may have a past degree, but you have learned so much about life and you have experienced so much during your time here. And that was true. And we weren't bothered about jobs. I mean, I should have been bothered about a job, but that wasn't what life was about. And I didn't have a long-term view that I want to be this, that, or the other. I wanted to change the world. That's what I wanted to do.
But what a luxurious feeling that was. I mean, it was a fantastic time to be there,
wasn't it?
It was a fantastic
time to be here.
I think the maths and maths physics departments, they were relatively strong at the time. We were a very unusual group. I think we were only 14 in the honours maths and maths physics class, or the the standout lecturer professor for me was Professor Sheila Tinney, who lectured in maths physics, and she was a fantastic lecturer. There were other very good lecturers too, in particularly maths physics, David Judge, and we had for pure maths Professor Gormley from Northern Ireland, who, if you could understand what he was saying, talked to himself most of the time when he was coming up. But I found it intellectually very interesting, and it was an intellectually rigorous degree.
Which probably stood to you in your legal training later.
Well, I think it did. Oh, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But I would say that my main focus and activity was the LNH.
But that which also stood to you in your legal career, obviously.
You learned so much, and when I was lucky enough.
Sorry, Mary.
Well, I was just going to say, when I was lucky enough to be elected as auditor, ultimately, I mean, what you did as auditor of the LNH and the experiences that you had were fantastic. They were scary from time to time, undoubtedly, but they were good.
We were coming towards the end of the Newman idea of education. Third level education was not vocational.
No.
Vocational education took place in vocational schools, where people went in, they did a trade, they knew what they were going in as and what they were coming out as. But UCD in those days, even though parts of it were quite repressive, that we've already alluded to, but it was a place where your mind was opened and you were exposed to people and to events and to occasions that you would never have been exposed to outside.
Its small size probably helped as well, compared to now, for instance. So that you did get to mix with people of other disciplines. I know, right, because you were out here, you didn't. But I think that might have had something to do with it as well.
Well, it did to some extent, although, the medical students kind of stuck to themselves.
They did a bit.
The architecture students kind of stuck to
the LNH.
They came to the LNH, but they didn't generally socialise.
I agree with you. You got in, going back to the main hall again, and the annex, the dreaded annex with the smell of grease, etc., and the greasy spoons. I was speaking to one fellow graduate recently, and he told me that he made it his mission in life to break the plastic greasy spoons whenever he was given them throughout college, to get rid of the brown stained plastic spoons.
We never mentioned Newman House 86, where those of us who were lucky to be in Earlsfort Terrace, I used to go over there all the time because all the rehearsals for plays were in there. There was a little place called the Little Theatre up at the very, very top of the building. And the French Society was there for me, the Spanish Society. By the way, my 2 degree subjects, I think I was 10 years working before anybody showed the slightest bit of interest in the fact that I had that degree. Or not even that I don't think anybody ever asked me for my degree, but that I got to use what I had learned. So there wasn't a career trajectory directly outside of it. But I think it must be so much harder for students these days. We were very privileged. We were really extraordinary privilege, because what percentage got to go to university back then?
2% of the student body when I was in UCD were from a working class background, of whom I was one.
2%?
2%. Gosh. And that wasn't a left-wing analysis, that was an official statistic.
And of course there were no access programmes or anything like that.
Oh no. There were county council scholarships for people from rural Ireland. If you were from a trades background, all my family were printers, there was nothing except my father's hard work to put me through college.
And it was, relatively speaking, it would have been expensive.
It was very expensive.
And I think even the county council scholarships, my recollection is that they were not of great assistance, particularly to the farming population, because they took into account the value of their lands.
That's right.
And they excluded them from it.
Yeah.
So,
those students, of course, had living costs in Dublin. At least I was able to live at home. But,
there's no doubt we were very privileged. And I suppose for the 3 of us as women, given the percentages that Doireann has already spoken about, I was certainly very lucky to be able to do the honours maths, and I could only do it because my parents had got somebody to teach me. I was warned before I went in by one of the members of the faculty that I actually shouldn't do it, because the last girl who had done that degree had had a nervous breakdown. It was several years since they'd had a girl doing the honours maths. But there was another girl out of the 14. There were 2 of us doing it, which was great. I wasn't on my own.
Yeah, but still.
But it wasn't, and I think that there were a number of other faculties. I remember having to go into Merrion Street to the engineers when I was campaigning for my election to the LNH, and to go down there. And gosh, as a woman walking into what is now government buildings in a very different...
It was a bastion of male privilege in there, wasn't it?
You took your life in your hands.
Sorry, Brian.
No, I was just going to say there's an interesting point there when you talk about the gender, and we were obviously in a minority. Not amongst the academics in science. There were 3 senior women professors in chemistry, zoology, botany. Women.
It's interesting.
I don't think we've had that since. That was back in the 60s, and they were very, very formidable women.
Yeah, they would have had to be.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah, well, Sheila Tinney was an example
And you
in
mentioned
ours.
the maths as well, maths physics.
And then there was, as I say, the wonderful Sister Benvenuta in arts. I mean, she really has to be remembered. She's still alive, thankfully. But she was just so inspirational, And I remember somebody you came to know very well subsequently there in the late Nuala O'Fuelon, was lectured me in first year English.
In first year English.
Yeah, and I remember she was quite glamorous, as she always was. And I remember her trotting along the corridor with her gown flowing out behind her. And she had these wonderful green sandals. I'll never forget them. They were so sexy, kind of quite out of keeping with UCD. But there were very few women in the arts faculty. Now, obviously, there were more than that whom I don't remember. It's a long time ago. But I certainly remember those 2.
Before we go, and we are coming to the end of this conversation, there were lots of nuns. Lots of nuns at the lectures, and they always wrote down everything.
Every word.
I remember. And which of you told me that they weren't allowed to socialise? Somebody mentioned this to me. Maybe
when I was doing metaphysics, to my best recollection, and I think it's correct because the wonderful Paddy Masterson is still a friend of mine, and we still talk about this. And he was a young lecturer in metaphysics at the time. We were 2. One other woman and myself were the only 2 lay women in that arts class. And there were hundreds, and they were all nuns and clerical students. And I remember Paddy saying to me one day, "Oh, Una, the clerical students used to look after you longingly as you fled the gates for yet another demonstration." But
it must have been tough on them and on those nuns, I think, to be...
I think they had a special room.
It was a time of huge transition.
I think they had a special reading room, is my recollection.
They did. They did. To escape to. I mean, it was
they had.
Whereas I'm afraid stop them having temptations.
I'm afraid our time has come to the end. It's been an extremely enjoyable conversation. Is there any one thing you can think of that you're really glad you did in your years in UCD?
Well, I suppose mine was to put my name forward and to stand in for election in the LNH. It was in its 115th or 116th year, and there had never been a woman auditor. But at the time, it didn't really arise in my election campaign, the fact that I was a woman, which was great.
Yeah.
And I understand I was the first woman to have stood for election, not just...
Mary, there was something about you, obviously, from an early age. But that you had the courage to do it.
But it gave me fantastic... It gave me fantastic self-confidence and experience to have done that. Yeah. I mean, if you sat in the bear pit in the LNHD 32, the most memorable night I was there with James Dillon, who was a figure of history, who came in, was booed initially. He had a bit of repartee. He had them in 1 second, eating out of his hand, and to sit and watch the audience rapt, and he ended up with a standing ovation at the end of it. Amazing.
Look,
I suppose that...
All right, I'll give you 10 seconds.
Yeah, since you asked the question about a memory, I think a pivotal moment for me, now that Mary has mentioned James Dillon, was listening to Noel Brown speaking to the Politics Society, and that really, in many ways, changed my life. Because, again, he was a wonderful speaker and very persuasive. And also, he used to speak very quietly. He didn't declaim like James Dillon. So you really had to listen to hear. But that would be one of the sort of standout moments.
Okay, and Bride?
A moment that has stood to me for the past 50 years, the lifelong friendships.
Yes,
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
A lovely note on which to end. So all 3 of you, Mary Finlay Geoghegan, Úna Claffey and Bride Rosney, thank you very much for your company today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We move back now to hear from some people who graduated in 1960. Two of them, Mícheáil Ó'Muircheartaigh and David Andrews, unfortunately can't be with us here today, but they have very kindly sent us video recordings, which we'll hear at the end. But I'm delighted that the third member of our 1960 class is with us. He's Colman Pearce, pianist, conductor and composer, who graduated with a BMus in 1960. He went on to study conducting then in Hilversum and Vienna, and was involved with both the light and the symphony orchestras in RTE for many years. He went on to become principal conductor of the symphony orchestra from 1978 to 1983. He then became principal guest conductor with the Bilbao Symphony Orchestra, and from 1987 to 1999 was principal conductor with the Mississippi Symphony Orchestra and its music director. He was the recipient of the Governor's Award for Excellence in the state of Mississippi and was also made a freeman of the city of New Orleans. In 2009, he was awarded a PhD for composing by St Patrick's College in Dublin City University. Colman, you're very welcome.
Nice to be here.
Can you remember at all the decision that you would go to UCD? Did that come automatically? You were at school in CBS Sing Street, I understand.
Yeah. And I was having piano lessons with Gerald Shannon, and there came a point when I had to decide to do music or not, which happened with me about the age of 15 or 16. And where to go for a third level education. As a musician, you either went abroad to an institute of music, be it in London, Glasgow, Vienna, or wherever, or you went to one of our universities for a BMus degree, which was reckoned a safe thing to do because you always could fall back if you wanted to teach, if you had a degree. So that was what a lot of us did. It wasn't necessarily refined to what we needed, but it was a good background, I always thought. One filled in one's musical knowledge through doing a 4-year university course. So that's what happened to me and many others. We went there.
Now, I understand it was quite a small group.
It ended up as a small group, dare I say select, because the BA students used to take in the first 2 years of the BMus course. They were there in their throngs up to the end of our second year. And in the third year, we could be forgiven for thinking that we'd lost a lot of people to whatever. And we were survivors because we were only a class of 5 or 6 in our third year, which I think remained the same until our fourth year when we did our final exam. So it was quite select. We got individual attention.
Indeed, I was about to say, was that an advantage really that you were small?
I think so. Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
But
when I went in there, I was ill prepared academically, musically, because I hadn't studied much theory. I hadn't done harmony counterpoint. And I remember Professor Hughes, who was assistant to Dr. Larche when I began, Tony Hughes said to me, Mr. Pearce, have you covered the usual background in harmony? I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, I would recommend that you get Kitson's book on harmony and bone up on that. So that was my first exercise to catch up with people who had had a more formal education. Yeah. I was concentrating mainly on being a performer. So I did that and I enjoyed doing it and I learned my harmony and counterpoint and so on.
That was quite a challenge.
Satisfied Dr. Hughes.
Yeah, but was that not quite a challenge to do it in a short period of time and to catch up?
Yes, but I was doing what I wanted to do. It was my love, music, so it was a pleasure, if a bit tedious at times, but however.
Yeah, well, we get nowhere without
had to do,
a bit of tedium now and again never does anybody any harm. You said that Dr. Larche was still there.
Yes, I was fortunate to be there for Dr. Larche's final 2 years. Rumour had it, and I think it's true, he stayed on to keep the position there for his brilliant pupil, Anthony Hughes, which is the way it worked. And of course, Tony deserved the position, but Dr. Larche wanted to see him succeed himself. So Larsha was there for those first 2 years of my course, and Tony Hughes was assisting him, I think, and then Tony took over as professor in my third year.
Of course, you weren't in Earlsfort Terrace. You
No.
were in Newman House, 86.
Yes, Earlsfort Terrace was reserved for exams, if I'm not mistaken, for the Aula Maxima there.
Yeah.
And Newman House was a delightful place to be, 86 St. Stephen's Green, and we were apart really from the madding crowd, so to speak, that attended the largest university in Ireland, UCD. And looking back on it was a very sort of privileged position we were in, enjoying all our lectures in Newman House, and we had the facility of Ivy Gardens behind us, Stephen's Green in front of us. It was nice, and I was living very close to all of this, so I used to go home for lunchtime breaks and all that stuff. It was very nice.
Lots of people did that in the 1950s from their work as well, when Dublin was just that much smaller, didn't they?
Yes, I suppose they did.
Yeah. But did that privilege, and I can see that it must have been to have that kind of intimate relationship with the people you were learning from, did that limit you socially? Did you interact socially with others?
I think you made your own decisions about that. I was not much of a joiner. I was very focused on music, so I went to tons of concerts, and I earned some money. I used to direct choirs, school choirs and stuff like that, and earned some money towards my tuition fees. And did the occasional social bit, but not much. I went to my first dress dance in my third year in UCD.
May I ask with whom?
Bernadette O'Neill. She was one of my colleagues in class, and I worked up my courage to ask her, would she come to the dance? And we went, and we had a nice time. And Bernadette, God love her, she died some years ago. She eventually joined the faculty in UCD. She was a lecturer there. I didn't know her in those days, but she was a delightful person. And
you didn't know her, but you were prepared to ask her to the dress dance.
Well, I knew her as a classmate, you know, and I liked her.
Yeah.
So.
I understand Saoirse Bodley would have been
He was
doing
also
a bit of teaching
lecturing
at that
time and studying for his own doctorate. And he was conferred with his doctorate the same year as I got my BMus. And Saoirse, a few years ago, sent me a photograph of himself getting his doctorate with his cap and gown or whatever, and myself getting my BMus degree on the same occasion. So that was nice to have. Yeah.
You said that you did things to earn money. You mentioned that you got involved with the orchestra, the UCD orchestra.
Yes. Dr. Hughes asked me one time if I would be interested to revive the student orchestra. I think it had sort of faded away. And I said yes. So that burgeoned and became quite big. And some of the students, I believe in the orchestra, they said, we'd also be interested in being in a choir. Would you take charge of that? So I did. So we had a student orchestra and choir, and I was conducting both, which was a great background for me as a conductor. You know?
Well, it must have been, because as you said at the beginning, it was more of an academic training than a practical one. Yeah. So you hadn't really been able to study conducting specifically at that stage. So that was a great training ground for you to have. But
you know, I think conducting, you have to do it by doing it. You have to learn it by doing it. So every opportunity to stand in front of a group of people, it's recommended that you do that as a choir, as an orchestra, whatever. And you hone your craft that way, oftentimes at the expense of the musicians you're working with. Dare I say?
Well, that would be normal behaviour. Everybody expects that.
Right.
When I was speaking to the women from the 1970s, we all talked about our extracurricular lives, which were very important. But it seems to me, thinking about it, that you couldn't have had your extracurricular life and your curricular life were one and the same thing in a way, weren't they?
Pretty much, yeah. I was totally absorbed in my music making, and I went to lots of what I would consider important things to do: attend concerts, learn by being there. It was a total absorption business.
Yeah.
And I loved my 4 years there because I learned an awful lot about a lot of different things, all to do with music and the arts in general, I must say.
And were you exposed to new things musically while you were there, internationally, I mean?
Well, Saoirse Bodley was interesting from that point of view, because as a composer himself, and dare I use that hackneyed phrase, at the cutting edge of modernity. George had studied in Germany, and his compositions at the time were avant-garde. So he introduced us students to a lot of avant-garde procedures. He wasn't teaching composition, but he couldn't avoid it, if you like. So that was revelatory. And he let us hear recordings of stuff that we wouldn't have heard before. Dr. Hughes, Anthony Hughes, was a brilliant pianist, and he was really a consummate explicator of classical works. So we learned a lot from him about Beethoven and Brahms and Bruckner and so on. And Saoirse Bodley, being a creator himself, I remember one time with glee, but I've said it to Saoirse since, and he laughed. I hope he did enjoy it. One time at the blackboard demonstrating something, he got totally stuck. And God love him, I took my hat off to him. He said, "Sorry class, I'll have to finish this tomorrow or the next day. I got myself into a bind here," which was lovely, you know. He was trying to work something out, didn't go, and that was another learning process.
Yeah.
Own up to something, you know, if you can't do it at the time.
Was the musical life of Dublin interesting at the time to you as a young person?
Yes, it was. I tell you things that were no longer. For example, the Royal Dublin Society recitals, which I used to attend religiously, so to speak, on Monday evenings, and maybe on Tuesday evenings. I think they had them on both evenings in those days. Same artist. Then it became Monday night and or Tuesday lunchtimes. They were a great source of education, those recitals. And then visiting orchestras, for example, coming to the Theatre Royal, which was the largest entertainment venue in Europe of that type. I think it was called a sort of vaudeville theatre or something. It held about 3,000 people.
Yes, it was enormous.
So we had visiting orchestras from all over the world. That was great. So Dublin it was bubbling over with things and lots of exhibitions of artists, paintings and what have you. So I enjoyed that aspect of it very much.
1956 it was when you started.
I started, yeah.
Were you conscious of being in what was effectively a very privileged elite, being a student in UCD at that time?
I think so. Perhaps with the passage of years, I see it as even more privileged than I did at the time. But at the time, I was aware that not everybody was going into third level education when I did, and my peers. Yes, it was, I think, a terrific opportunity. My parents made it possible for me, but I also helped, as I mentioned, by earning some money on the side as well, and that was all help. And that was a learning process too, dealing with choirs. And yes, we were privileged, and I think most of us knew that. Those who are born to privilege don't usually recognize it. I wasn't born to privilege, and I did recognize it, I think.
Did you make any long-lasting friendships in those years?
No, because my fellow students, they scattered pretty much.
Did they?
Deirdre McNulty got married and went to live, I know in the Netherlands, I think in Hilversum, if I'm not mistaken. Anthony O'Rourke emigrated. The last time I met Tony, I was adjudicating, I think, in the north of Ireland, and there he was teaching in the north of Ireland. And Bernadette O'Neill, my first date for a dance, so to speak, I perhaps could have kept in touch with her, but again, she got married. She married the O'Rahilly, you're familiar with that term? Yes, and she became a faculty member in UCD. So I didn't really meet these people that I had worked with. So my friends were made outside of there, really.
Yeah. And was the relationship between the students and the faculty members, was that quite a relaxed one as opposed to other faculties where it would have been much more formal?
Well, I've no basis of comparison really, but I felt pretty much at home with the lecturers. I thought they did a good job, and I tried to please them by turning in exercises and what have you. Tony Hughes and I suppose, became reasonably close years later, himself and his wife Nuala, and we often met socially. And I remember, God love him, Tony, one time he came to me after a concert in the concert hall, came to me with his daughter, I think Katrina. I remember it was Rachmaninoff's Second Symphony, and he said, I think he was calling me Colman in those days, because in UCD I was always Mr. Pearce. That performance, he said, was just wonderful. Every nuance. And he said, my daughter knows it even better than I do. She's a great Rachmaninoff fan. So they were two of the best accolades I have had in my life from my former professor. That was lovely.
Yeah, lovely. Well, Colman, thank you very much indeed for coming in today.
Is it all over?
It's all over, I'm afraid.
My goodness, you made it easy. Thank you.
You're very welcome. And before we leave you now, we will hear from David Andrews and Mícheáil Ó'Muircheartaigh, both graduates of UCD in 1960.
My name is David Andrews, and I have a fairly decent memory of my place in UCD in 1960. I was doing a Bachelor of Civil Laws degrees, which I understand was introduced for the first time as a degree in the university. But I played an awful lot of soccer during my time there with a first-class soccer team, people like Willie Brown and his two brothers, all from Longford. Willie, of course, became an outstanding full-time amateur international. I was also I actually passed the civil law degree and went on to do a BL in the King's Inns, all of which was achieved, believe it or not, in the space of a year. I also fell in love in UCD with Anne Wynne, who was from Dundalk and subsequently left for Rome, where she married an Italian count and unfortunately has passed. But I had good memories of UCD from beginning to end, and I wish the future well.
Mícheáil Ó'Muircheartaigh. I grew up in a place called Doireann 3 miles from Dingle on the verge of the Atlantic Ocean. There was a great regard and respect for education in the area, and it's still there. I spent 10 years studying in that great institution of UCD, and the reason for that was the attitude towards education where I grew up. I was teaching full-time through most of the early 50s, and that led me to register for the evening classes for the BCom degree. The years I spent in UCD were wonderful times, great professors and lecturers. There's an Irish phrase, Ní Nacht go Curla Céile. It reminds us that we do not realise the strength we have until we all pull together and in the same direction. Well, we're Lechéiler together today, even if it's online, and we're all pulling in the same direction as a country like never before. I was a sports broadcaster for 8 years when I started the BCom degree. I found UCD to be a great source of information, and the courses also taught me to be very inquisitive. That aspect was right with me throughout the degree, and it stood me well years later when a Dublin team to play Kerry in a challenge game in Tralee appeared in 1 or 2 papers. A new name appeared on that list, and it simply read K Morgan. I was interested to find out who he was, and somebody told me he was studying in UCD. With that information, I headed to a training session of the UCD Sigerson Cup football team. On inquiring about K. Morgan, whom I expected would be with them, the captain told me they had never heard of him, and that was the case with each and every one present. I knew somebody in the admissions office at the time, and I headed there straight the next morning. A search revealed the name of Kevin Morgan, and I was given his address, the Coconut Drimna, coconut spelt with a capital K. That was my next stop, and I found Kevin and his mother there living above the shop. I spoke to Kevin and told him that I would like to do an interview with him for a weekly programme I had on Radio na Gaeltacht. The problem was that it was through the medium of Irish, and Kevin had very little Irish. So I taught him a few phrases quickly. We started on, recorded a nice little piece, and that was the first time ever that Kevin appeared on radio, newspaper or TV programmes. He went on to play for Kevin Heffernan's team, winning 2 All-Irelands, And before he'd won the second, he was on the Manchester United soccer team. They won the cup final, but Kevin was sent off. Another first for the man from Drimna. Knockat and Mockay on sale. That means life can be very funny. That brings another Irish phrase to mind, go merrimid bioer an aum shorish. In translation to English, it is a wish that on this date next year may we all be alive and well and celebrating another anniversary of our great times in UCD and still looking back with fondness on those days and casting eyes forward and to the future as well. We hope that by then the people of this planet will be free of the effects of coronavirus. Isn't that a lovely wish from the legacy of tradition? Slánagh Galeracharda, mind yourselves and those around you, and I'll repeat once more, go merrimid bioer an aum sharish. May we all be alive and well 12 months from this time. Slánagh Galer.
Thanks to all of you who joined us here to celebrate the Golden and Diamond Jubilee reunion, although it was remote. If you'd like to share this episode with friends or family or want to watch it later, you can find it on the UCD Alumni YouTube channel. Now, as many of you will know, UCD is committed to supporting its students through this difficult time and giving all incoming students, regardless of their background, access to the wealth of information and education here in UCD. If you'd like to support UCD's efforts to provide financial and mental health support to those students who need it most, please visit the UCD Foundation website. If you enjoyed these conversations, the next UCD in Conversation is coming up on Thursday, September the 24th, and will feature authors Emma Donoghue and Sarah Moss. So just go to the UCD alumni website to register to watch those. I hope you enjoyed our trip down memory lane. Thank you also to our contributors, of course, the classes of 1960 and 1970. And we do hope that we can all get together in person at some stage in the future to celebrate this milestone event. In the meantime, keep safe, stay well, and the UCD Choral Scholars will see us out with their remotely recorded performance of The Maid of Culmore. Slánagh.
From sweet lovely Derry to fair London town, there is no fairer harbour all around can be found, where the children each evening go down to the shore, and the joy bells are ringing for the Maid of Culmore. First time I saw her, she passed me by, and the next time I saw her, she bid me goodbye. But the last time I saw her, she broke my heart sore, for she sailed out of Ireland and away from Culmore. If I had the power, the storm forced to rise, I would blow the winds high, I would darken the sky, blow the winds higher and the salt seas to roar on the day that my darling sailed away from Coolmore. Shores of America, my love, I'll go see. For it's there I know no one, and no one knows me. But if I do not find her, I'll return like a pilgrim, I'll wander for the maid of Coolmore. Like a pilgrim, I'll wander for the maid